Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on modern management, what it is, why it matters, and how to do it right. I'm Jonathan Nichols, Global Sales and Services Executive at HP. I'm joined today by Andrew Hewitt, a Senior Analyst at Forrester, Eric Grimes, HP America's Services Lead at Microsoft, and my colleague from our Infrastructure Practice Lead at HP's Professional Services Organization, Paul O'Connor. I'm super excited to have the breadth of knowledge with us here today. Before we jump right into it, a few bits of housekeeping. First, we're going to make this available via recording. And this is something that you can do post-conference, so you don't have to worry about taking notes today or anything like that. You won't miss anything. And secondly, we're going to be taking some questions from the floor at the end of the webinar. So if you have a question for me or any of the panel, you can just use the Zoom function and to ask away. Okay, first up, we're going to be hearing from Andrew, a senior analyst at Forrester Consulting. Andrew's been the driving force behind a large research project in the industry, Shift Towards Modern Management. This was commissioned by HP back at the end of 2020. He's collected large amounts of data on the subject and is the preeminent authority on the topic. We're really excited to hear what he has to share with us today. So everybody, Mr. Andrew Hewitt.
Awesome. Thank you, Jonathan. It's such a pleasure to be here today talking about one of the areas that I've really researched so much, and it's great to be on such a distinguished panel of folks that have so much experience with modern management. So I'm going to take the first couple minutes today of the webinar and really give a bit of an update as far as what is Forrester's perspective on modern management, what does adoption look like, what are we seeing from some of our clients. And if you're not familiar with Forrester, we are a global market research company. We work primarily with Fortune 500 companies, and over the past year or so, we've had a lot of different discussions and consulting engagements around helping people move to modern management. So that's sort of the backdrop for today. So let's dive in a little bit here. First, I want to talk just a little bit about how we define modern management here at Forrester. So traditionally, when you think about modern management, you tend to think about two specific things. One is unified endpoint management across basically four major operating systems, right? iOS, Android traditionally, as well as Windows and Mac OS. That is one component. The other piece of it is enabling, cloud-based management using essentially, a mobile management type of framework to go out and manage traditional clients, right? So when we apply modern management to Windows 10, we're really talking about cloud-based management. So we typically tend to think about those two components. So unified and cloud-driven as kind of the first steps for modern management today. And so one thing that I want to make clear is that although that is certainly the baseline, and we're going to focus a lot on that today, we actually think that modern management is even greater than just using the cloud and using a unified approach for endpoint management. It really is a complete modernization of how you look at lifecycle management of endpoints overall. And there are a couple of additional factors that you'll want to think about as far as your modern management strategy goes all in. So in addition to leveraging the cloud and unifying your endpoint management across multiple operating systems, we're also seeing the rise of self-service for modern management. So employees being able to get their own set of applications, right? It's not just the endpoint, it's the delivery of the applications to the endpoint and really tailoring those based off of persona, or enabling someone to go and access and download their own applications if they need additional ones. The concept of being contextually aware is another major difference in modern management compared to traditional client management. Specifically, what we think about with context here is conditional access. So one of the things we'll talk about today is the importance of establishing device enrollment and compliance as part of your modern management strategy. That is one component of your conditional access strategy that might look at user authentication, network risks, user behavior, all those sorts of things. And so endpoint management is now getting tied into identity and access management as well. So it's no longer kind of just this silo. Definitely think about modern management as being much more contextually aware and tied in with those identity and access management systems. Automation is another key component of modern management. So, I think in a lot of cases, enterprises out there today have really been managing endpoints in the same manual-driven process, for many years, decades even. And so the role of automation is continuously important for those organizations. And specifically, what we tend to think about as the major area of automation for endpoint management is on the deployment phase of it. So a big goal that a lot of enterprises have today with modern management is, can I drop ship a PC directly to a user in a home setting? So I can ship a device directly from, say, HP's factory, have it use autopilot, and then deliver it directly to that person. Particularly in a remote work environment where maybe you're not in an office, that becomes really attractive, right? And so the initial automation is certainly part of how we look at modern management. But another component is automation of changing of policies based off of maybe a role change or a user behavior change, a change in the level of risk from a conditional access perspective as well. And so when you think about modern management, there's an automation component as far as the deployment of the initial device, but also increase intelligence and automation around profiles and configurations and settings as well. And so definitely think about, how can modern management start to help you remove some of more of the undifferentiated manual work that maybe you're accustomed to in traditional endpoint management. And the final area here is that modern management, we believe, is very analytics driven. And this will be different, according to your maturity as an organization. But this is one of the big key takeaways is we're seeing a lot more companies being interested in collecting endpoint telemetry data in order to make better decisions about deployment, management, retirement of devices, swapping out of devices if they see potential issues coming up as far as battery life or overall performance. And so modern management is, yes, unification. It is using the cloud to manage these devices, but it's also ensuring that you're collecting enough of that data to make smart decisions about your endpoint fleet in the future. And we believe that a lot of these analytics tools will start to become a lot more predictive as far as how do we look at our endpoint fleet going forward. And so, mature organizations today are using some of these endpoint tools. Sometimes they're using third parties, but we are starting to see a lot more focus on embedding that telemetry collection as part of that modern management strategy. So just to set things up front, we do think that modern management is broader than just the unification and the cloud-based APIs for client management. But we'll focus on kind of those first two as part of this discussion today and give you some good steps as far as how to get started. And when we think about why organizations are going down this path, I want to just preview some of the research that I've been conducting. I recently chatted with about 40 different large enterprises and asked them all about modern management and user computing. About 35 of them said, we're going to go to modern management over the next year. It's a huge priority for us going forward. And here are some of the quotes from that research that I would like to share with you today. So this is from a large US-based insurance company that's really looking at modern management to really improve the user experience, right? They can get employees onboarded faster. They can upgrade their machines faster. They can swap them out faster if they had a break, right? It's a lot more of an agile process than the traditional client management was. Another enterprise architect, this is a French-based company, said it's going to help them really provide that anywhere work strategy to enable them to really serve their users regardless of location, but also allow them to tailor the right applications that they send down. So in contrast to traditional application packaging and doing that on a one-by-one basis, modern management starts to say, okay, this is the persona of the person. This is what they need to be. This is what they need to have to be productive. And let's deploy all those systems for them regardless of their location and do it in an automated fashion. So for this company, that was one of the major goals for them as they went forward. The third one here is from an enterprise architect at a multinational food distributor. You've probably heard of them. But for them, the big area for them is they want to get out of corporate imaging of devices. They really want to do that automation deployment directly from the factory, right? They're spending so much time getting devices in their depot, doing the imaging, doing all the configuration, putting all the user personalization in place. And what they want to get to is a place where they can just eliminate that entire middleman altogether and really make themselves a much more agile shop going forward. And so these are some of the reasons that people are looking for, better user experience, better support for remote working, better personalization, and automation of some of those manual tasks that frankly take up a lot of time, but aren't super differentiated for the business. Now, I do want to give you a little bit of update as far as where we see organizations. And I will say that this chart has changed dramatically over the last year. I'll call your attention down to the bottom of the screen here where I show kind of overall adoption, right? We think about 80% is still managing devices in a very traditional way, traditional client management tools, on-prem using GPOs. It still makes sense for a lot of use cases, and a lot of folks have legacy apps and so forth that they want to provide as part of that model. Sometimes there are regulatory reasons where maybe they don't want to use the cloud. And so we think the vast majority are still in this model. The second category here is co-management or coexistence, where you're kind of using a combination of cloud-based mobile device management APIs on an endpoint plus client management tool to kind of use that agent to do more in-depth types of activities. Maybe it's application distribution or scripting, but you're using the cloud-based APIs for setting basic policies, passcodes, etc. Maybe a Wi-Fi configuration, those types of things. And folks are definitely moving in that direction of saying, let me move at my own pace so I can take advantage of the cloud. But I have some elements of client management right now that I still need to keep in the traditional way. So we do see, I think, about 10% of organizations going that direction. Another 10%, and this has been really escalated over the past year because of the pandemic, have moved to that fully modern management framework. And when that comes to sort of Windows 10 management in particular, that's been something that has really been accelerated by the pandemic, as folks said, we really need a way to make sure that we can enroll users remotely, patch the devices really efficiently in a remote workforce. And so we've seen huge increases here. Last year, or prior to the pandemic, I would say, I was saying about 5% of organizations were in this. So it's roughly doubled in my perspective. And of course, as I shared earlier, from those interviews that I conducted, a lot of organizations have this as a major priority over the next 12 months. So it's moving in the right direction. This is a really great time to get started and get educated on some of these things. And we'll help to get you kind of moving on that path as part of this webinar today. And finally, just as I wrap up here and transition to my co-presenters here, I want to give just 5 high-level key steps as far as how you can get started here. So the major thing that I see organizations really struggle with, and I think we're going to talk about this as part of the panel as well, is one, establishing that initial visibility, getting all the devices just enrolled in the platform and establishing that level of device compliance that'll feed into your conditional access engine, whatever identity and access management provider you're using out there. So getting that initial visibility is one of the key elements, getting things enrolled in whatever UEM tool that you have in place. The second major thing, which takes a little bit more time than that, is sort of unifying your policy, right? Moving a lot of those traditional GPOs over to CSPs, converting them, deprecating them in some cases, and really taking a hard look at what are your policies today. How are they falling short as far as what you need for the future, and really prioritizing that migration. That component does tend to take a fair amount of time. It's one of the more heavy lifting components. But if you're doing something like a co-management, for instance, that can be a little bit of a lighter lift. And so that's why a lot of organizations prefer co-management. Modernizing patching is another key element here, right? Can I move to more of an internet-based form of patching rather than relying kind of on traditional VPNs for patching? Can I leverage things like peer-to-peer, for instance, to improve that patching capability? That's a key component of how you go forward. Rationalizing apps. This is something that's happening across the board, but it's very important for modern management as well. Some of the sticking points with modern management do have to do with legacy app distribution, right? Or legacy app patching, for instance. And so the more that you can focus on you sort of looking at that application portfolio and saying, okay, what sorts of apps am I going to modernize? What am I going to deprecate? Are there things I'm going to buy off the shelf that are going to replace some of the legacy apps? Are there apps that I can virtualize or refactor and run in HTML5? Those types of decisions are really important as you start to go forward with modern management. And this is something that happens ongoing throughout the process, but it's definitely something to be aware of. As you go down this path, you will need resources to help out with that rationalization capability. And then the final thing here is gain insight, use experience management tools. This is really the analytics capabilities of looking at that telemetry data. And there are two ways to do this. If you're a mature organization, you already have this. You can use experience management to basically help you along the way identify what types of groups are suitable for modern management. If you're not at that level of maturity, you could use this towards the end and then start to say, okay, how do I track my user experience better going forward on these devices now that I've transitioned to modern management? So just a couple of steps just to kind of think about as you get started here. And as I wrap up here, my main key takeaway here is that the major change that we are seeing here, of course, is this transition to modern management, but the use of analytics and telemetry data to better plan that, but also starting to use that to continuously improve your user experience. When I showed that overall graph of modern management with user experience at the center, that's what I mean. Eventually you want to get to a place where you can track, continuously optimize, improve the user experience over time. So that about does it for me. I'll wrap up there and then transition it over to Jonathan.
Thank you, Andrew. It was very compelling. And I found, most interesting, you explored a lot of management of change concepts within the research that you have provided. And I found it very fascinating that many of the customers have been talking about automation and analytics, because really, when you're delivering a service, it's about people, process, and tools. And when those analytics and automation come in, it just does provide for continuous improvement, which is really exciting. So thank you for sharing that with us today. All right, well, next up, we're going to hear from Eric Grimes. Again, Eric is the HP Services lead at Microsoft. He's going to teach us a little bit more about how to look to simplify the mobile and PC management.
Thank you, Jonathan, and pleasure to be here to speak with everyone. So I'm going to build a little bit on what Andrew said with regard to mobile device management and how Microsoft goes about it and how we partner with companies like HP. So first, the characteristics of it, it's built on cloud services, meaning that the identity management, the application management are all based on cloud-based policies and procedures, rather than, as Andrew alluded to, the previous thing of managing a global image or multiple images within a corporation. It greatly simplifies the IT process for them in that it's no longer this very manual type of process and having to be on site, if you will, with your users. And then one of the best benefits of this is that it's not only business-owned devices, but bring your own device. So many users have multiple devices. They might have their corporate-issued desktop or laptop, but then they also want to use perhaps their own tablet or certainly their phone. And corporations need to be able to manage that access and that security for a user who is using their own device for when, as Andrew said, perhaps you're changing to a new role or you're leaving the company. The organization needs to be able to manage that access very quickly and easily for someone who has access to corporate data on a device that is not corporate owned. So very, very critical to consider those pieces of it. Now, how does it simplify the management of this? So it's modernize the device and OS provisioning. So it's really managing that the ID, the user themselves, and then your application provisioning for that. It's simplifying the application lifestyle. So as you change versions of an app or upgrade an app, you want to be able to easily push that to users without, again, having to develop a whole new image. Probably most importantly is consolidating the security policies and settings. We all know how critical security is now and how often and how nimble your security policies have to be. So from a cloud managed aspect, that gives the organization a much more agile form of managing security policies and can adapt much more quickly to ongoing and changing threats. So how do we do this? For deployment itself is autopilot. So what is autopilot? It's basically the golden path, if you will, for no need for IT to touch the devices. And it greatly simplifies the process for both IT and users, and then also can be integrated straight into the supply chain with partners like HP. So it's built on key technologies, again, with autopilot. We talk about the Windows 10 build. Basically, almost every device that's out there now is autopilot eligible. For that identity management, it does require Azure Active Directory for managing all of your different users. And then using Intune. It's built primarily around Intune for the mobile device management aspect of managing that device, and then combined with the identity management of the users. So how exactly does this happen? So in the deployment service, what happens is your partner like HP will provide the device IDs that are on order to the IT admin. And then they can also take existing devices which are out there, so you can redeploy those devices or make them managed now in the cloud rather than locally. And then those devices get uploaded to the Windows Autopilot deployment service, which is basically the cloud service for managing those IDs. And then you configure the profile for each individual user, or by group, by team, however is best for the organization. And then HP can ship that device directly to the end user. Now, obviously, this has become a much bigger need for this type of service in the world of our pandemic that we're in. But it was already kind of growing, but it's just accelerated now. We've accelerated several years worth of remote service like this with given the pandemic. And then once the user receives it, basically you enter your email address and password, and then all of those policies will get loaded. Your application suite will get loaded, and then users can also have access to other applications that they need to run their business, and they can do this on other devices as well once their identity is managed in the cloud. So not only on the new device that they get or an existing device that is now cloud managed, they can also have those same policies driven to their other BYOD devices as well, so they can have all of their applications on multiple devices. So several paths to modern management that you can take. A cloud-first approach is basically a new business, if you will, who's starting from the ground up with cloud management. That's not your typical scenario these days. And then you could do a big switch transition where basically you move from this legacy on-prem type of managed service to a cloud managed service. That is typically not the path that most large organizations would go with. They would do one of the last two. So a group by group transition, meaning a certain team or a region, which they would start with. Certainly, doing a proof of concept is a great place to start. But then once that is proven out, then define how and who and when you move to this eventual full cloud management scenario for the organization. Or you can do an iterative, a co-management type of scenario where you slowly move different workloads to modern. So that could be, a certain team on a certain workload moving to modern. So whatever works best for the organization, that you can define how you should proceed with that. There are, many ways to get there, but certainly getting there, requires some help of a partner like HP. And being able to manage those identities, manage the devices, and manage your applications in the cloud.
Well, thanks, Eric. I really thought it was very interesting about the multiple paths of getting to modern management. And it really does speak to, I think, a little bit to the point that Andrew spoke about the management of change. And I also really was looking forward to having Paul take us through some practical elements towards moving towards modern management. I think it's a nice tie-in here, and particularly, how to avoid rip and replace transitions. So I'm going to hand this over to my colleague from infrastructure practice at HP Professional Services, Mr. Paul O'Connor.
So thanks, Jonathan. It's great to be here with everyone today. In my role as infrastructure practice lead within HP Professional Services, I'm responsible for defining and creating offerings to help customers on their journeys towards modern IT. As a result, I have a unique viewpoint, as I understand both the high-level concept of modern management, but also the actual reality when it comes to supporting and working with customers day to day, when it comes to designing, integrating, and implementing modern management into their environments. As Andrew mentioned, modern management encompasses more than just device management. But for many, modernizing their device management is the first step on their journey. Traditional device management techniques assume your end user devices are on the corporate network and require on-premise infrastructure to both set up and manage. But in today's hybrid world, end users are working from any location across a range of devices. So enterprises need solutions to manage their entire device estate over the internet while ensuring they are secure and their corporate data is always protected. Modern device management, therefore, is all about moving or minimizing your on-premise device infrastructure and instead adopting cloud-based solutions while empowering users and enabling them to be more productive. I see a lot of parallels in the adoption of modern management to what we've seen previously with both Identity and Office 365. Going back 10 to 12 years ago, most organizations managed their email on-prem, running on Exchange servers, safely guarded and monitored behind their four walls. At the time, a lot of enterprises wouldn't even consider the idea of a public cloud's SaaS for email. But gradually, they began to realize the business value of adopting an as-a-service model, where they no longer needed to worry about managing Exchange servers, file servers, migrations to new versions, etc. Instead, they could redeploy the resources to focus on higher value activities within their business. So when Microsoft released Windows 10, they provided a new vision about how we could manage a device using a modern MDM SaaS tool, or as a service tool. I remember designing and implementing modern management for a large organization in Europe back in 2016. Back then, it was an all or nothing approach. The company in question had been spun out from a larger entity and were looking to simplify their device management. They were a greenfield scenario and had the chance to jump straight to modern. But most enterprises have an existing estate with years of investments put into their device management infrastructure. Jumping straight to modern management was seen as a solution simply too risky or only viable for a portion of their estate. Based on customer feedback, Microsoft, as Eric pointed out earlier, introduced a concept known as co-management or coexistence, being able to manage a device both using on-prem tools such as Configuration Manager or an MDM tool such as Intune. And with this new coexistence, the ability for organizations to transition at their own pace. This allowed organizations to build upon their existing device management investments and begin moving workloads to the cloud. With the events we've seen of last year, many organizations have struggled to support their end users at home. Traditional device setup techniques do not support device setup and provisioning outside of the corporate network. As a result, the pandemic has expedited organizations' IT roadmaps, with modern management now high on their agendas. Or similar to the O365 adoption, the conversation within organizations has changed from will we move to when are we moving? As I mentioned, moving to modern management is a journey from on-prem to the cloud. When you move straight to modern management or in a controlled way, gradually by combining old and new methods under the same umbrella as shown in the slide. Many customers need help in understanding how these new tools and methods work and how to get things going. Modern management is a new approach which takes some time to understand when you dig a little deeper. There are a lot of harder, more technical questions you need to think through as well. But thankfully, here at HP Professional Services, we've been fortunate enough to have worked with customers across the globe in their journey towards modern management. So by now, we're pretty good at knowing what works and what doesn't. We offer a suite of modern IT services to assist customers to achieve their modern workplace goals. Our approach has been to enable customers on their journey while identifying their milestones along the way. During past engagements, we also highlighted the advantages of moving to modern management, while how to enable and leverage new solutions. We have focused on their use cases and break down their journey into manageable chunks with short, medium, and long term. The most common use cases can be seen here on this slide: our new device scenario, recovery or break fix, and existing devices. A great starting point that resonates well with customers is modernizing their device provisioning by enabling autopilot in their environment for both new device and break fix. But we also highlight the options customers have to modernize the management of existing devices and thus avoid the rip and replace transition by seamlessly moving these devices to modern management in that controlled fashion that customers are looking for. So, Jonathan, to summarize, the conversation has changed. It's no longer will we move, but instead, when are we moving?
Well, thanks, Paul. And thank you, Eric and Andrew, as well. You guys have really given us some great points on today's webinar. Now I wanted to kind of open it up to you. We've got a few questions, and I'm sure that there's those that are watching out there going to have some questions as well. We'll get to those shortly. But first off, a question for the panel. How do you think the pandemic and remote working has impacted the shift towards modern management? Paul, why don't you start?
Well, with the events of last year, we've seen many organizations struggle to support their end users at home. Traditional device setup techniques, as I mentioned, simply do not support provisioning outside that corporate network. So as a result, the pandemic has expedited organizations' strategic IT roadmaps, with modern management now high on the agendas.
Well, thanks for that, Paul. Hey, Andrew, what are some of the learnings people can often make that can be avoided?
So I would say that there's two major challenges that I've seen as surprising for organizations as they've moved towards modern management. One is the change management aspect from a people perspective, right? I've heard from some clients that this is a significant change, right? Your employees might be used to a very white glove service of getting a device delivered to them when they come into the office, as opposed to sort of that experience of getting the device shipped to them and then them having to boot it up and kind of log in, et cetera. And so one of the mistakes that I do see and opportunity to really improve is, can I provide better change management for the employee when I move to something like modern management, right? Do I have enough training resources, videos, Q&A resources for them to really get themselves up and running, especially if they're really used to more of that white glove service. So that would be the one, lack of a focus on change management from an employee perspective. The second piece of this is that sometimes organizations don't think enough about the identity layer and where they are on that journey towards cloud-based identity and access management. So if you're running on-prem, it can make it more difficult to go out and do some of the things that you'd be doing, with modern management, specifically if your identities are hosted on-prem. And so thinking through some of the complexities of the identity component too, sometimes that means you need to build some custom capabilities in order to deploy this. The support is improving across on-prem identity and access management providers as well. But that's one of the things that is often overlooked is, where am I from an identity perspective? And is that ready for some of the modern management capabilities as well? So zero in on that as you start thinking about this transition as well.
That's great, Andrew. And Eric, I'd like to maybe pick up on what Andrew said. What do you think are some of the pros and cons versus managed and self-managed?
Yeah, it's a very common question, Jonathan. I think it comes down most often to a degree of control. When it's self-managed, then there is, of course, a greater degree of control there, where they can customer can institute their own policies for identity management, device management, application management. But it does require your own in-house expertise to be able to do that, where many organizations these days want to, as Paul alluded, devote that expertise to other areas of the business. Now, when it is managed for you by a partner, you do lose a little bit of that control, but you do have a defined set of policies, particularly around security, where you have best-in-class, most up-to-date security policies that are constantly implemented for a customer. So it really comes down to kind of weighing those factors on employing that expertise in-house for that degree of control, or relying on perhaps other subject matter experts with a trusted partner.
Well, thanks, Eric. And that's interesting because, Andrew, your research showed that security is one of the biggest concerns that they have in making this move. How can firms ensure that security isn't compromised?
It's a great question. So modern management gives you an amazing baseline to build your security strategy on top of, right? Even thinking about just basic device compliance, getting devices enrolled in something like an Intune or another MDM provider, right? To be able to go and say, let's make sure that we enforce passcode restrictions, that we have certificates deployed to the device, layer that in with authentication from your IDP, and all of a sudden you have a pretty strong foundation to kind of get started on moving down a zero trust strategy, where I have device compliance, I have a certificate-based authentication, and I have a multi-factor authentication, or ideally a passwordless form of authentication on top of that, right? So the device access component can actually, limit a lot of that initial exposure in the first place. And what we are starting to see with a lot of these unified endpoint management tools is the basic, capability to just go and set encryption across your devices, especially if that's cross operating system. If you have Intune or one of the other third-party tools, I can go and set encryption across my Windows 10 devices, but also across all the other different types of operating systems that I might have as part of my portfolio as well. And so it gives you a strong, basis to kind of get started by just establishing that device compliance, setting encryption levels across multiple different types of operating systems, and really kind of giving you that foundation up front. And of course, you always want to go deeper, right? You want to have advanced threat protections against malware and so forth. And there's a whole bunch of other security categories that you would look to supplement on top of that. But modern management itself, just because of the way it's architected and the fact that it is contextually aware, does give you that strong foundation from which to build your zero trust strategy on top of.
Very insightful, Andrew. It's interesting. We talked about the pros and cons. We've talked a little bit about security. Paul, where's the best place to get started?
Well, thanks, Jonathan. I think this is something I regularly get asked by when I engage with customers. And there's three main points I usually make. The first is having a clear goal or transformation strategy is absolutely essential. This starts with a vision that has executive support and alignment to the overall company strategy. Their buy-in is simply a must. Secondly, to execute successfully on this strategy requires a defined technical roadmap to ensure the concept direction, the future end state are crystal clear. To achieve this, the IT organization need to understand the new architecture and integration points into their IT environment to enable that future vision, as well as the milestones along the way, so everyone is aligned. And third, a trusted partner in this is really a must-have. This is simply not made up. To come across some serious gotchas when you're halfway through a new complex transformation would not be uncommon for those who have not done it before. So for example, the last thing you want to do is find out that those business critical applications are not going to work in your new modern environment. These things need to be teased out ahead of time, solutions put on the table and concerns talked through. Here at HP, that is what we do. And if for some reason we can't, or something doesn't work, which isn't that often, but in the event that it does, we know the people who can help. HP and Microsoft have been partners for years, and we know how to work through unique technical problems with Microsoft on the customer's behalf to drive these right outcomes.
Oh, thank you for that, Paul. I think that was very, very, very good. We've got a few questions coming in from the floor also for those that were watching our webinar today. And I think we've got a few more minutes to go through some of those. So Eric, here's a technical question for you. Does provisioning require the use of Intune, or can other MDM solutions also be used?
No, good question. So it's kind of built for Intune, but other MDMs are supported. So most of the industry-leading ones, as well as Intune, of course, can be supported to deploy in Autopilot and via Autopilot manage devices.
Thank you. Another one here. I think this was probably best suited for Andrew. What do you think the role of the virtual desktops have to play in the role of modern management?
Great question. So, as part of the pandemic, we saw increases in both modern management, but also use of virtual desktops as people wanted to provide that, secure access from home. And so what we're continuing to see is organizations kind of balance that need for modern management over the physical endpoint, but also using virtual desktops for specific use cases. Sometimes that is a remote workforce use case where they really want to have that segregation of data between the virtual desktop and the local client that it's running on. In other cases, maybe they want something that scales really quickly, in which case they might use a cloud-based virtualization platform to get maybe a contractor or a seasonal worker up and running. And there are also a lot of use cases where maybe you have a very homogeneous computing environment, like let's say a call center where folks kind of use mostly the same types of applications, and you really want to simplify kind of your management. If you give people a session hosted access into a virtual desktop where it's a shared instance, it actually can decrease kind of your management cost and processes over time. And so we're seeing the use of both virtual desktops and modern management. As people transition away from traditional client management to modern management, they are starting to rethink, what are those use cases that make sense for a virtual environment versus a physical environment that's managed by a cloud-based unified endpoint management tool. So still a lot of momentum in that market as well.
That's great, Andrew. Thanks for sharing that. Paul, one more for you. I'd like to kind of see, how do you see modern management changing the day-to-day of endpoint management?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, Jonathan. Today, in these days that we've, I suppose, especially in the last 18 months or so, IT admins are even more stretched. They're expecting to simply do more with less. As Andrew alluded to earlier, the number of devices types that IT admins need to support is exploding. Think of how you swap devices in your day-to-day just to perform your day-to-day work. In the morning, for example, I log into my device here. Maybe I take a break later and I take a phone call, and maybe it's through Teams when I'm having a coffee. And later in the evening, I might be on a tablet. So all of these devices are consuming those corporate resources outside of the corporate network, yet on these personal devices. So IT admins are expected to secure these devices, secure the data, while staying on top of their day-to-day activities. So as a result, they need this type of new modern managed environment or infrastructure to handle these use cases, where no longer is the enterprise bounded by the corporate walls. Instead, it's all out on the internet. So the identity is now the playing field we need to take care of.
Well, thank you, Paul. I have one last question, and I'd like each of our panelists to give us one piece of advice that if you could give a customer just getting started out on this transition. Eric, maybe you could kick us off.
Oh boy. I think I'd go back to what Paul said. HP has a great offering of services to help you understand exactly where the organization is today, and then map, where do we want to be, and then from there can have a blueprint to plan out exactly how you get to a modern state. So that, I think, having that plan in place, understanding exactly where you are today, and a clear path of where you want to go is the place to start.
That's great. Andrew, what do you think?
I would say really focus on that ROI and that business case as well. What types of business outcomes are you going to get from moving to modern management? It's not move to modern management just because, right? It's because you're going to improve your overall user experience, improve your remote work experience, improve your operational agility as far as how you manage, and you're increasing security. So make sure that you're not losing sight of the fact that you're doing this for a business reason. You're not just doing this just to modernize for the sake of it. It's really connected to really helping your organization move away from undifferentiated heavy lifting and really being much more competitively differentiated in the marketplace because of the services that you provide in your endpoint management portfolio. So that would be my major piece of advice.
And Paul, what would be your parting piece of advice for the webinar attendees today?
I think it's quite simple, Jonathan. That is, work with HP Professional Services. But as I touched on earlier, that's point 3. There's 2 others that come in. One is having that strategic roadmap with the executive buy-in, and 2, having that clear roadmap on how you achieve the strategy.
Well, that's fantastic. And, I really want to just thank our panelists for joining us today. I think that's all that we have time for today. So thank you, everybody, for coming, and we look forward to hearing from you soon.